I want to start out, I guess, I just want to ask you what inspired you to pursue this 4-decade-long career in researching NDEs?
Well, I was raised in a scientific household and taught that when you don't understand things, you need to approach them scientifically and try to understand them. And when I first started encountering near-death experiences back in the early 1970s, I couldn't make any sense of them at all. It didn't make any sense. I was a materialist at that point. I didn't see how people could possibly leave their bodies and see things outside their bodies. So I thought, well, if I don't understand this, I need to collect some cases and try to figure out what's going on here. So I started collecting cases and trying to find patterns in them that were consistent across belief systems, religions, cultures, and so forth. And then trying to test out different physiological hypotheses like lack of oxygen to the brain, drugs given to patients. Um, and now, 50 years later, I'm still trying to
Wow.
understand it.
If you don't mind, I know this is a little personal, but coming from a more materialist
Sure.
type household, because you weren't raised in any religious background, how did your family feel about your research?
Right. Um, well, we didn't talk about it much. My father was pleased. He was the chemist that thought you need to look at things, and he thought, well, this is something you don't understand, so it makes sense to look at it. He, of course, assumed, as I did then, that we would eventually find a simple physical explanation, but he thought it was worth looking at because it was an unexplained phenomenon that needs to be
Okay.
explored.
And what do you now that you've done this for so long, how do you stay motivated to continue this research?
Well, I think there are two things. One is that it's still an unexplored area, something we don't have a good answer for, and therefore the scientist in me wants to figure out what's going on here. But more importantly, because I'm basically a clinician, I'm a doctor, I see incredibly profound effects on people who have these experiences. They are never the same afterwards. Their attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior are totally transformed in a matter of seconds, and these changes don't go away. And as a psychiatrist, that makes me curious about what's going on here to make these things change, and how can we help people adapt to these changes and integrate them back into their normal everyday lives.
Do you find that to be a difficult process to help people reintegrate following these experiences?
In a minority of cases, it's difficult. For most of them, they are highly motivated to make changes and to adapt, um, and they're eager for any help they can get.
Okay. Um, can you tell us a little bit about some of the commonalities? 'Cause I know I've read your book, After, which I can't recommend enough, but um, you talk about some of the
Thank you.
commonalities across backgrounds, religious backgrounds. Um, can you talk about some of those common elements to a near-death experience?
Sure. Well, the first thing that's most surprising to me as a scientist was that at a time when the brain is not functioning very well, when people are in cardiac arrest, their hearts have stopped, or they're deep anesthesias, their minds are more vivid than ever. They say their thinking is faster than ever, clearer than ever before. Their perceptions are sharper and clearer. They also have very strong emotions. In most cases, positive emotions, a feeling of overwhelming peace and well-being, a sense of being loved unconditionally. They may have unusual things that we call paranormal, for lack of a better word, things like a sense of leaving the physical body, sometimes knowing things about the future that they shouldn't know. And many of them report otherworldly experiences, like being in some other realm or dimension that's not the physical, encountering other beings that aren't physically present, which they may interpret as deceased loved ones or deities. They often go through a life review, which they relive, not just see, but relive their entire lives in a matter of seconds. Uh, and then at some point, they may come to a border or point of no return beyond which they can't keep going and come back. And they're either told to come back against their will, or they make a decision to come back for some specific purpose.
Okay. Yeah, and we covered Dr. Mary Neal's story, which is kind of covers one of those elements.
Yes.
Uh, and I was wondering if you could maybe share some of the more compelling stories that you've encountered in your research.
Yeah. Well, as you said, Mary's is one of the most compelling. Um, she was definitely unconscious for a long time. And she got not only the typical mystical experience, but also information about future events that later came true. But I didn't investigate her personally. I just know it from after the fact, reading her book and talking to her. But I have encountered a few patients that really just blew my mind. I couldn't understand what's going on here. And one type of experience like this are the out of body experiences where people see things totally unexpected that they shouldn't have been able to see. For example, one fellow in his mid 50s, he was having quadruple bypass surgery. Four vessels around his heart were being replaced. He was totally unconscious. And in the middle of the operation, he tells me later, he left his body and looked down and saw his surgeon flapping his arms like he was trying to fly. And he demonstrated by putting his hands on his chest and then wiggling his elbows around his head. And when he did that, I had trouble not laughing because I'd been a doctor at 30 years at this point. I couldn't imagine anyone doing this. You don't see doctors on television doing this. So I suggested to the patient that he might have been hallucinating at that point. And he said, "No, this is real. You ask my doctor, he'll tell you." So I did ask the doctor, and he admitted that yes, he did do that. He developed this habit which he'd never seen any other surgeon do. When he lets his assistant start the procedure, he puts on his sterile gown and gloves and then walks into the operating room to watch them. And to make sure he doesn't touch anything that's not sterile, he places his hands flat against his chest and then points things out to his assistants using his elbows so he doesn't risk touching anything with his fingers. And he demonstrated just the way the patient did. I don't know how the patient could have known that, and yet he did. More bizarre than that, though, are people who, well, let me say, a lot of people claim to see deceased loved ones in the near death experience. And that can often be dismissed as wishful thinking or expectation. You think you're going to die. Of course, you want to be greeted by deceased parents, spouse, and so forth. But in many cases now that are fairly well documented, people claim to see deceased individuals who were not yet known to have died. This is not a new phenomenon. Pliny the Elder wrote about a case like this in the first century. But one of the more dramatic cases I knew is a fellow in his mid 20s who was admitted to the hospital with a serious pneumonia, and he had repeated respiratory arrest issues where he couldn't breathe and had to be resuscitated. And he had one nurse who was his primary nurse working with him every day, who was very young also. And one day she told him she was going to be taking a long weekend off and he'd have other nurses substituting for her. So he said goodbye to her and she left for the weekend. And while she was gone, he had another respiratory arrest and had to be resuscitated. And in that event, he had an elaborate near death experience. And he found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene. And there, to his surprise, this nurse came walking towards him. And he sort of did a double take and said, "Anita, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Jack, I need you to go back to your body. You can't stay here. I want you to find my parents and tell them I love them very much and I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB." And then she turned and walked away. When he later awoke in his hospital bed, he had a complete memory of this experience. And he tried to tell it to the first nurse who walked into his room, and she got upset and left immediately. It turned out that this primary nurse had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday. And her parents had come to town and surprised her with the gift of a red MGB for her birthday. She got excited and jumped in the car and took off for a test drive, crashed into a telephone pole and died instantly, a few hours before the patient's near-death experience. There's no way he could have known that she had died, or certainly how she died, and yet
Wow.
he did.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I ended up doing this podcast is I've worked in the emergency room for probably 2 decades now, and I oh, I'm
You
sorry. I
froze
said
there.
one
I
of the
didn't hear
reasons
that.
I ended up hosting this podcast is I've worked in the emergency room for almost 2 decades, and we hear these stories. I've heard them from patients. I've I've actually heard them from
Yes.
people that I know, and initially, it was something that we would just kinda dismiss as, hallucination, a dream, something like that.
Right.
Um, and then came across your research, obviously Raymond Moody, uh, as well, but I wondered, it seems like healthcare workers are kinda on the front lines of this type of thing because we're the ones there when those
Right.
experiences happen. I'm wondering first, from your perspective, how your studies, have been received both when you started and now, because it seems that this is becoming a much more widely accepted area of research.
Yes, it is definitely. I've seen a tremendous change in the last half century. When we first started out talking about these experiences in medical conferences, the doctors didn't know what we were talking about. They thought we were making this up or the patients were fooling us. Of course, the nurses and the paramedics knew about it. They're right there and they hear them, but the doctors did not necessarily. So there was a polite silence in the audience. And now, 50 years later, when we talk to the same medical conferences, it's rare that a doctor doesn't stand up in the audience and say, "Let me
Mhm.
tell you about my near death experience." So there's been a tremendous increase in the awareness and acceptance that these things really happen to people. There's still a lot of skepticism about what causes the experience, whether it's a true mystical experience or a physiological accident or both. But most doctors now accept that, number one, they happen to a fairly large number of their patients, and number two, they're important experiences that the patients need to talk
Do
about.
you still receive, criticism for some of your research, or is that largely kind of going away?
It hasn't gone away. It's decreased. People are more sophisticated in their criticisms now, which is a good thing. They used to just say, "Oh, this is ridiculous. It can't happen," and now they are more inclined to point out certain weaknesses in the research, which are legitimate. Um, but they're criticizing in a much more sophisticated way, which I think will help
Okay,
further
that's
the
great.
research. I will say though that unfortunately I can't say that our research is what made the difference in having this accepted worldwide. I think it's more the public uh, media presentations that have spread the word around and got most people to know
Yes,
about
and
these
that's why one of
things.
the reasons we're really grateful that you do stuff like this, because it's
Yeah,
as you said, if you're a scientist, you wanna pursue what is truth, right? But it seems, that
right,
for a long
right.
time, if you did not have a strictly materialist perspective, it would be frowned upon for the most part. Um, so it's great
Yes.
to see that changing a little bit. And I mean, with that in mind, uh, do you feel that your research and I guess not just you, but everybody there at UVA is kind of contributing to
Yes.
changing perspectives on consciousness?
I think it has. It's really hard for me to say because so much of the research that's being done in consciousness in general, uh, each person builds on the others, and it's hard to single out what the effect of one particular person or study has been. But I think there has been a tremendous growth in the sophistication of consciousness research in the past few decades. There are still, to be sure, a lot of diehard materialists who insist that we're going to find a simple physical explanation for all this stuff. We can't now, but we will someday. But that is not a scientific position. That's a philosophical perspective that someday we'll find it. It can't be disproved because, well, when is someday? It could be anytime. So it's not scientific, but it's a reasonable metaphysical or philosophical
Okay.
position.
And I don't want to put you. I don't want this to be gotcha journalism or anything, but um, I did want to ask you about something from your book because I was actually reading and I
Yeah, sure.
stopped and called a few people because there was a chapter. Sorry, I might have frozen there for a second. There was a chapter where you talked about this filter theory, and you had
Yeah.
mentioned not just NDEs, but
Yes. Yes.
um, a couple other phenomenon that kind of contribute to the idea that filter theory may be reasonable. Could you talk about kind of how you view
Right.
filter
Right.
theory?
Sure, sure. Let me say first that this is a metaphor. There's not really a physical filter anywhere. This is a metaphor, and it's been around for 2,000 years. Um, we're taught in college and medical school that the mind is what the brain does, that all our thoughts and feelings are created by the brain. And if that's true, then when the brain goes down, you shouldn't be able to think at all. And that's clearly not the case with near death experiences. As you said, there are other experiences as well besides NDEs in which the brain seems to be not functioning very well, and yet the mind is. Um, 2,000 years ago, Hippocrates wrote that the brain is a messenger of the mind. And there's been this um, secondary thread throughout neuroscience for a long, long time now, saying that, yeah, maybe the brain and mind are not the same thing. And they liken the brain to like a radio receiver or a television set that receives signals from outside and then translates them into a signal that we can see and hear. The television set doesn't create the show, but you need it usually to see the show and hear it. And likewise, they say that the brain is not creating our thoughts, but it receives thoughts from the mind and then puts them into neurochemical and neuroelectrical signals that we can understand. This should not be surprising because we know there are lots of filters in our bodies. You don't see the entire electromagnetic spectrum. We only see a small portion of the wavelengths. We see the visible light. We don't see infrared and ultraviolet because it's not important to us. Our eyes develop to help us survive in the physical world. We don't need to see infrared to do that. Likewise, our ears filter out uh, sounds that other animals see or hear because we don't need them. Um, and the brain, too, evolved to help us survive in the physical world. So it's there to let in uh, stimuli that help us find food and shelter and a mate and avoid predators. It's not there to help us see deceased loved ones or deities. That's not important to survive in the physical world. So, under normal circumstances, it filters that stuff out and just lets in the quote important stuff that'll help us survive. And when the brain starts to fail, that filtering function gets weakened and other consciousness contents seems to come through.
Yeah.
And there are people, I should say now, that are looking at where these filters are in the brain. And there are several filters we're finding. There's something called the default mode network that modulates what stimuli get through. For example, right now, you're hearing my voice, so it's important for you to hear me. It's not important for you to see me. So this default mode network will then tamp down the visual input and tamp up the auditory input. There's also something called the cortico thalamic loop that does the same thing. That selects certain phenomena, certain stimuli that are important right now, and boosts those and shuts down others. So we know that the brain does do this. So it's not surprising that maybe there is content that is normally ruled out by the brain.
Do you think that this is not something we've covered yet on our show, but uh, terminal lucidity? I know you mentioned that in your book as well. Do you think that that is
Yes,
fairly supportive of the idea of filter theory, and if so, how?
I think it is. This is a phenomenon where people with end stage dementia, like Alzheimer's disease, who have not been able to communicate for a long time or ever recognize relatives, suddenly become completely lucid again and can recognize people and carry on coherent conversations. And we don't have any medical explanation for this. You don't regenerate a brain that's been deteriorated by Alzheimer's disease. And then often the family gets very excited, thinking, oh, maybe they're recovering, but then they die within a few hours or sometimes days. So it seems as if what's happening is that the brain is getting weaker and weaker and eventually stops filtering out things so that the brain can then recognize people and communicate again. Uh, Now, we don't know as much about terminal lucidity. The research is only a few years old now, so we may yet find some other explanations for this. But it occurs not only in dementia, but in brain tumors, abscesses, strokes, a wide variety of phenomena where the brain is sort of impaired, and yet the mind seems to function better than
Have you
ever.
heard any compelling, like strictly materialist explanations for terminal lucidity?
Well, there are hypotheses. They say that when the brain is shutting down and the normal ways you can speak and recognize people are deteriorated, uh, your brain has the ability to develop other ways, other circuits, and call them into play to do this. Um, Now, we know the brain can do that. It's incredibly what they say call plastic, where it can assign parts of the brain to fulfill the functions of other parts. But that's a gradual process that takes place over months or years. For example, when you lose one function, the brain can sometimes compensate for it in other ways over a period of time. But in terminal lucidity, we're talking about a change that takes place in minutes or hours, and the brain can't reorient itself in that
Have you
quickly.
seen or heard of cases where um, the uh, renaissance, let's say, of the brain in these patients with terminal lucidity involves physical changes as well? Say they've been bedbound or wheelchair bound and can move better.
Yes, yes, they become not only more cognitively aware, but they become more active. They may show more emotional responses. In some cases, they don't, in fact, speak again, but they show signs of recognizing people, blowing kisses to them, smiling at them, which they haven't been doing for months and months. And in some cases, they have been
Wow.
able to get up and walk.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you too, when you see cases, I had one that my producer brought up here, where there was a study published in a peer-reviewed Proceedings of the National Academy of Science journal, where they examined the brain activity of 4 dying patients, and they were trying to explain potentially the bright light phenomenon, um, the visual phenomenon associated with near-death experiences. And using EEG, the
Right,
researchers observed that the cardiac arrest or acute asphyxia led to high levels of gamma activity in the brain. Um, and they proposed essentially that the gamma power in the brain could be an indicator of consciousness and be associated with higher level functioning, problem solving, and things like that. So they were essentially assuming this could be an explanation. When I was wondering if you could address that
right.
study, if you know much about that one, and then also,
Yeah.
do you get when these things come up, do people email you frequently? Is it something that's discussed, in your department?
Yes, very, very frequently. In fact, there are probably 3 or 4 such studies published every year. Um, and they generally make very elaborate claims of what they're showing that are not supported by the data. And that's the true of this study as well, published by the University of Michigan. They searched over a 10-year period and found 4 patients who were comatose, um, and they measured EEGs on them, the brainwave measures, after they had taken them off mechanical ventilation support. So they're having trouble breathing. They took the mechanical support off and then watch what happened to them. In 2 of these 4 patients, there was a brief burst of gamma waves. Uh, Now, there was no evidence, none at all, that this gamma wave was associated with conscious experience. The patients did not show any sign of being awake or aware or of having any experience. They were just lying there immobile. Um, Furthermore, these patients were not in a cardiac arrest. Their hearts had not stopped. They were uh, unconscious, appearing to be uh, comatose. And when they took the ventilation off, um, they remained that way. They did not appear um, activated in any way. And in fact, when you measure their heart uh, measurements as well, those 2 patients that had the gamma waves also had an increased heart rate. Their hearts had not stopped, so that they were measuring what happens in the brain when they take off ventilation, but the hearts are still going very well. So they were not showing people whose hearts had stopped, which is what they claimed in their paper. Uh, so the EKG, the heart measures, were not showing that their hearts had stopped. And those are the ones that had this gamma activity. So what they were measuring is what happens in the brain when oxygen is decreased when you stop the ventilation. The oxygen was not totally emitted. There was still plenty of oxygen getting there. But the gamma activity occurred only in those two patients where they had active heart rates still. I should also say parenthetically that gamma waves certainly are associated with consciousness, but they're also associated with lots of other things as well, including muscle contractions. And when you're measuring from the head, you're also measuring twitching in the forehead muscles and the temple muscles, and it's hard to separate what's activity coming from the brain and what's coming from the
Wow, that
muscles.
would have been really nice to have noted that.
Well, yes, it would have been. We did publish a paper correcting some of these issues, uh, but we do that all the time. You know, every time a paper is published, we communicate with the authors and we point out the changes. And sometimes they get very angry at us, and sometimes they acknowledge, "Yes, you're right. You know, we should have been more cautious in what we said."
Well, that's great that there are some researchers willing to acknowledge holes in the study for sure.
Yeah, there
It's
certainly
encouraging,
are.
I would say as well.
Yeah.
Um, for you,
Yes.
you personally, Dr. Grayson, what do you feel you've encountered stories from patients or data in your research that makes you feel fairly confident that consciousness does not necessarily originate in the brain?
I think that's true. I can't say that I'm 100% certain about that. We still don't know very much about the brain. We know we're just scratching the surface with it. But I will say that the assumption that the brain creates all our thoughts does not have any mechanism associated with that. No one has ever proposed a mechanism by which a chemical or electrical change in the brain can produce a thought. It's just assumed by these neuroscientists that we will someday understand how that happens. But as of the 21st century, no one has the suggestion of a hint, of a clue, of an idea of how this might happen. It's just assumed, well, of course it must be. What else could it be? Um, and yet we have phenomena like terminal lucidity and near death experiences in which they seem to be having active thoughts without much brain activity. I should also mention that we've been doing neuroimaging of psychedelic drug trips in the last 10, 20 years. And in those also, they're finding that the more elaborate mystical experiences with drugs are associated with a decrease in electrical brain activity. We used to assume that these drugs work by stimulating the brain to hallucinate. And now what appears to happen is that they work by decreasing the filtering of the brain so that the brain can then experience this wider range of consciousness.
So then, how would you? Because I was going to actually, I'm so grateful you brought that up. I was going to ask you about things like DMT um, and how you
Yeah.
differentiate the experience of uh, a trip on DMT versus a near death experience. Like, what is the difference between the two in terms of your research?
Yeah. Well, they are very similar, and they can be very similar. Um, and we did a large study. I was part of an international group that collected 800 near-death experience accounts and over 15,000 drug accounts from different drugs, and we looked at which drugs produce those experiences that are most like the near-death experience reports. Just looking at verbal reports. And we were hoping to get some clue as to what's going on in the brain that may be associated with near death experiences. What we found is that the drug that produced these experiences most like near death experiences was ketamine, an anesthetic. The next was DMT, and then psilocybin, and then salvia or sage. And these work on the brain by very different mechanisms. So it really didn't tell us anything about the mechanism that may be associated with near death experiences. What may be going on is that all these different drugs, again, decrease the filtering activity of the brain. Um, but there are some ways in which the drug experience differs from near death experiences. And one is that in the NDE or near death experience, people feel totally out of control. They didn't look for this experience, they didn't want it, and they suddenly find themselves in this bizarre world that they have no control over. And in the drug experience, on the other hand, they intentionally took the drug. So they have still some sense of, well, I'm in control of this. I made it happen. And that puts a very different context for the experience. Furthermore, in a near death experience, you lose complete awareness of what's going on around you. Not in the initial stages where people leave their body and look around, but when they get into this other realm, they're completely oblivious to the world around them. And that is, generally speaking, not true of the drug experiences. They see the physical world around them, it may become more and more distorted, and then the other realm is sort of superimposed on top of this. Now, I haven't had a near death experience, so I can't speak firsthand, but I've talked to people who have had both near death experiences and drug experiences. And they say, although they're similar, they are not the same. One person said to me that on psilocybin, he saw heaven. And in his near death experience, he was in heaven. Um, Another one said it was like being in combat and watching a war movie. If somebody asked you to describe what you're seeing, you may use the same words, but nobody would think it's the same experience. And that's the way we are with looking at verbal descriptions of near death experiences and drug experiences. There are only so many words we can use to describe this otherworldly experience. Um, a light is a light. What else can you call it? Although it may not be the same thing. Looking at the sun is a light. Well, looking at a lamp is a light. And being in the presence of a living being entity that radiates unconditional warmth and love, that's a light also. They're not the same thing, but we don't have any other words to describe them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's some really interesting um, NDEs. One we talked about blind NDEs uh, on one of our episodes, and that was incredibly fascinating to me to
Yes,
hear how someone who's never seen might
yes,
perceive light, for example, and experience colors and things they'd never seen before that time. So another fascinating kind of area of
no,
study, I guess. Um, I wanted to ask you
yeah,
on this topic of the difference between those types of experiences. Um, Someone
right,
who
right,
has an NDE tends to have a really strong memory, strong connection to that experience, quite different than someone who had a dream
yes,
or hallucination. As those things fade, people that have NDEs can typically still remember those things. And
right.
I was wondering if you could offer an explanation or a hypothesis onto why that is.
I don't have a good answer for it. I can speculate that the context of the experience, the fact that you are nearly dying and that you didn't want this experience, it just came to you unbidden and it totally took over your life, makes it very hard to forget. Whereas in a dream or hallucination, it's usually a temporary thing. It doesn't have profound after effects because you don't see it as a turning point in your life the way a near death event is. So the context may have something to do with that. But furthermore, people who have had near death experiences tell me that it's more real than real. It's more real than anything we experience in this life. And they said to me things like, my experience of being in that other realm was more real than talking to you right now. The way talking to you real right not right now is more real than my dream last night. So I don't know how to quantify that. I haven't had any death experience. I can't say what they mean by that, but they're almost consistent in saying that the NDE is more real than this reality.
Wow. Um, what areas? How do you envision the future of NDE research? Because I think we read a quote by Sam Parnia who described the idea of going to the moon to people in 1900 as being absolutely insane. And he said, similarly, maybe we're seeing
Right.
something like this with NDEs, where we're able to research something that would have been unfathomable in the past. And now maybe we're actually learning some things about what happens when you die. I mean, I wonder if you have any thoughts on questions you might want to answer further in your research.
Yeah. Well, I think Sam is right about that. I certainly hope he has. Um, it's not that we didn't know about NDEs before. The average person on the street knew about them for centuries. It's just that scientists didn't know about them. Um, so scientists and clinicians didn't know about these things until the last several decades. Actually, if you look in the medical literature, going back to the 1800s, you see isolated accounts of these experiences in the literature of Germany and France and the US. But they're usually dismissed as being hallucinations, and people didn't follow up with the patients and see what happened to them afterwards. I think the next generation of researchers are coming to this field with um, areas of expertise different from mine, and that'll open up whole new areas of exploration. Some are more sophisticated in terms of cross cultural research, where they can compare it with other types of experiences. Um, and some are more sophisticated in terms of the neurophysiology or the electrochemistry or the pharmacology. So I think that we're just starting on the path of trying to explore the full range of these phenomena. As for me, I'm basically a clinician, and I'm getting more and more interested in the uh, the practical effects of these experiences and how they change people's lives. So most of my research now is in that area. Where we just are doing a study now of people who have difficulty coming back to life after a near-death experience, looking at what is it about the experience that gives them trouble, um, who they seek out for help, what types of help they're seeking out, what types of help they received, and what about that help was helpful and what was not helpful. And we also want to take the next step then and look at the people who are the helpers and see what they thought was helpful and not helpful, and see whether it compares to what the experiencers thought. We're also doing a study of doctors and what their perceptions of near death experiences are, and what they think are the barriers they face in trying to talk to patients about their near death experience. And we've interviewed about 1,000 people now, so far, doctors in this area. And to our delight, very few are saying that one of the barriers is that I just don't believe this stuff, or I think it's just a sign of mental illness or neurological disorder. Most are not saying that. Most are saying the primary barriers are number one, I don't know enough about it to talk about it. Number two, I don't have time in my practice to talk about it. Uh, so I think the good news is that those are things we can help with education of doctors. They're not an attitudinal problem. They're basically an educational
Yeah, and
problem.
I actually want to come back to that because my next question was about how healthcare workers could potentially, change their approach. But you did mention something that I had read about before in terms of mental illness and things like schizophrenia. But
Yes.
based on your research, there doesn't seem to be any correlation between mental illness and near-death experiences, correct?
That's correct. Now, we've done research looking at the incidence of mental illness among near death experiencers, and it's the same as it is among people who don't have mental illness. We've also looked at people who have diagnosed psychiatric disorders and looked at the incidence of near death experiences among them. And again, it's the same as it is for people who don't have diagnoses. So there doesn't seem to be any association between near death experiences and mental illness. Um, I will say also that when I first heard about near death experiences decreasing people's fear of death, which is the most prominent after effect of these experiences, I was worried this would make people more suicidal because I had worked with people who were thinking of ending their lives but were deterred by fear of what might happen if they die. If you tell them nothing's going to happen, it's great. Will that make them more suicidal? So we did a study of people who were admitted to the hospital with suicide attempts and compared those who had a near death experience as a result of the suicide attempt to those who didn't. And what we found, to our surprise, is that those who had a near death experience became much less suicidal than those who didn't have an NDE. And we asked them to explain this apparent paradox. They said things like, well, now I still have the same problems I had before, but I realize there's a meaning and a purpose behind everything that happens. And the problems that used to make me want to feel I needed to run away from life, now I see as things I'm supposed to grow from and learn from. They also report that I've lost my fear of death, but along with that, I've lost my fear of life. I'm not afraid of jumping in with both feet and living life to the fullest because if I take risks, what's the worst that can happen? I die. So they end up enjoying life a lot more after the near death experience.
Wow. It's you obviously don't want wish for a near death experience, but it is fascinating to think about these changes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'll say also, that in regard to schizophrenia, another psychiatrist, Mitch Leister, and I did a study of um, the hallucinations, the voices that schizophrenics hear, and the voices that near death experiencers hear. And the differences were striking in how it affected the patients, the people. People who have schizophrenia almost universally did not want to hear the voices. They wanted them to stop. They thought the voices were impairing their lives and making them feel more uncomfortable. Whereas the near death experiencers liked having these voices. They thought they were enriching their lives and did not want them to go away.
well, that makes sense. Do you? Uh, is there anything that you think could be done, or how can healthcare workers um, better approach NDEs? And is there a way that they can encourage patients to want to talk about these experiences more, rather than feel like they'd be, cast aside or just listened to, I guess, after those experiences?
Yes, yeah, sure, sure. A lot of near death experiencers would tell me that when they had their experience 20, 30 years ago, they tried to tell someone about it and they were told, well, just forget it, it'll go away. It's just the drugs you were given. And of course, it doesn't go away. It just tells them that nobody wants to hear about this. So I think healthcare workers need to understand first that these are very common experiences. Um, they happen to about 5% of the general population, or about 10 to 20% of those whose hearts actually stop. So it's not unusual. Secondly, that they are normal experiences that occur to normal people under abnormal conditions. They're not associated with mental illness, and that people feel that they are the most important thing that's ever happened to them. They need to talk about them. And all you need to do is let them know you want to hear about it. What you don't want to do is start imposing your own beliefs on the patient, saying, well, this is what I think it is, whether it's a religious thing or a physical thing or hallucination. You don't want to tell them what to think of it. You want to just tell them you want to hear about it and you want to understand what they think about it. Because these experiences have profound after effects on people's attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior, which includes the attitude towards healthcare and whether they want to obey the doctor's orders and so forth, how they feel about being ill. And you need to understand how they feel about these things in order to treat them
Yeah, and
better.
that's what you just mentioned. I know that with Howard Storm and his NDE, because we covered that one recently, he actually felt
Yes.
compelled to not listen to the physicians where he was, and return home. And I had to put a caveat in there of I wouldn't recommend this to most people, but I guess in that experience it worked out.
Yeah.
Um, I was wondering,
Yeah.
for you, um, are there any, as you've listened to, I would assume thousands of these stories, um, are there specific cases
Yes.
that you've encountered in your research that had a profound effect on you or your worldview?
I think rather than any one astounding experience, it was the accumulated effect of thousands of them and the consistency among them and the consistency of how they affect people's lives. I've seen people come back with different values. They almost always feel that in this other realm, I realize that we are not separate individuals. We're all part of the same thing. And some will use a metaphor of a wave in the ocean, that you're the same The wave is composed of the same material that the rest of the ocean is, but it has a separate structure, at least for a little while. And eventually it'll fold back into the rest of the ocean and be the same. But they're all part of the same stuff. Others have said it's like looking at your fingers. They look like separate entities. When we look at the whole hand, you see they're really interconnected, and you can't hurt one without hurting the whole hand. And they experience this in their, particularly in the life review part, where they will often review their lives not only through their own eyes, from the perspective of other people in the events also. And if they've hurt people, they will feel that hurt themselves. And if they've been kind to other people, they will feel that kindness themselves. So they come back really embracing what we call the golden rule. Do unto others as you have them do unto you, which is part of every religion we have. Um, but for them, for the experiencers, it's no longer a guideline we're supposed to follow. It's a law of nature that they've experienced. So they end up treating people differently. They're much more compassionate. They're much more altruistic. And they often have to change the way they live their lives. Um, I've seen marriages break up because of this. I've seen careers change. I've known people who were um, career military officers or police officers who could not shoot after a near death experience, and they had to change their careers. I've seen people who were cutthroat businessmen who, after a near death experience, said, it no longer makes sense to me to get ahead at someone else's expense. So they either changed how they do their work or they changed careers entirely. And they often end up retraining to be in some helping profession, either medical care or clergy or social work or teaching, something where they're contributing helpfully instead of just getting
Is that
ahead.
pretty common across people that experience NDEs that they have these long-term profound changes?
It is. It's almost universal that they have these long term, profound changes. Now, based on what your life was like beforehand, it may not require many changes in your life, but it often does.
How about people who maybe before the NDE have a fairly materialistic perspective? We come from a culture that's pretty common, and
Yes.
they have the experience, and now it's sort of broken down for them, essentially, right? The way somebody who
Right.
has faith can go through deconstruction. I assume there's a similar process for someone who is materialistic and, goes through a
Yes.
deconstruction, and the possibility that maybe not everything they experience is coming from the brain. Um, is that
Right.
is there any
Right.
I guess what I'm asking is, for those types of patients, is what do you recommend for them? Is there a way that they can work through that? Are there places that they can go, people that they can talk to?
Yeah, it's often very helpful to talk to other near death experiencers who have been through this. I know a lot of people who were atheists beforehand who came back either totally embracing the idea of a divine entity and of the divinity in all of us. And I've known others who were just totally puzzled by it and say, I don't understand it. There's obviously more going on than I thought there was, but I can't make any sense out of it. And it helps to talk to other people who have been through the process, and they can help you talk about how they dealt with these issues and help you through that as well. That's also helpful for the families to talk with other families of near death experiences and see how they deal with
Yeah,
these
that's
changes.
fascinating. It seems like it's very, I looked into um, groups locally, and we're based in Nashville, and there are not a
Yes.
ton of options. I saw there's, a lot of cities around North America have places you can
Mm.
go meet, but it's not something that's common here.
Yes.
Guess it would be good to see.
No, but there are some online groups, support groups, where you can get that same support. It's not the same as being in the same room with them, talking with them, but it does offer some support if you're
Okay.
not near a group.
All right. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I do appreciate you being here. It means a lot to us and our listeners. Um, I did just kind of want to touch base on one other thing, which is, are you working on
Mhm.
anything
Sure.
currently? What type of research are you doing right now?
Well, as I said, most of my research now is focused on the after effects, how it changes people's lives, how we can help people with that. Um, but there are also other smaller research projects we continue to do. Um, I'm getting towards the end of my career, but I've got a couple of young PhD graduates who are working with me now at the University of Virginia, and they each have their own interests. One's interested in near-death experiences that occur during childbirth or associated with childbirth or pregnancy. Another's interested primarily in people who hear voices after a near-death experience. So I'm just sort of helping them figure out how to design a good study for this and
Okay.
so
Well, I
forth.
really appreciate it, Dr. Grayson. Thank you so much for being here. If
My pleasure,
people want
Dustin.
to find you or reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Through my website, www.brucegrayson.com. I would also suggest the International Association for Near-Death Studies. That's www.iands.org, which has a lot of information about near-death experiences and also a list of support groups in different parts of the country